Is this the same Clemson? Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking national champions 2018. We'll see if they can defend here in 2019 and probably won't get a good feel of that for quite some time. We got Pigskin Pete on the line. You can join him on YouTube right here, Pigskin Pete. Check him out. Great college football content. How's it going, man? How you doing today?
You already know the answer to that, Mark. I'm amazing and fantastic. How you doing?
I'm going to try to get there someday. We're doing our best. We are striving to hit the Pigskin Pete level of contentment, we'll call it.
I'm going to make a confession here real quick before we start. I always say that I'm amazing and fantastic when even sometimes I'm not. So I do kind of fudge it sometimes.
But you know what? I agree with that. You got to throw it out there. You got to make that confession and say, this is who I am. This is who I am, regardless of how I feel. And that's going to be the end result. That's it.
That's it.
All right, Pigskin. A lot of your Clemson folks not necessarily content about not necessarily the football team and the performance on the field, but the amount of respect that's being given or not given for a team that's being knocked right now for its schedule, which it can't control. It scheduled what it thought was going to be one of the 10 to 15 best teams in the country in Texas A&M. And otherwise, hey, the ACC hands to Clemson whatever they hand it, and that's what it is right now. But a lot of people not real impressed with Clemson.
Yeah. Listen, that's fandom for you, right? I mean, sure, you hear this all the time on your channel as, you know, who has Clemson played, who has Ohio State played. That really has no bearing in how good a football team is. I said yesterday on one of my videos, Alabama or Clemson could play Wofford 18 times in a row. Doesn't make them any less of a great football team. You can watch any of these top 5, 6 teams play football for 5 minutes. And if you're completely objective, you know they're elite. Okay. There is a lot of misinformation going out there, or at least the public perception about Clemson's team not being as good as it was last year. Listen, I'm not a stat guy. I don't live and die by stats, but all the stats say differently. The only stat that's different this year from last year is the interceptions. You know, that is a problem. Nobody likes to see interceptions, but if you just look at the offense and the defense as a whole, if you look at offensive yards per game, well over 500 yards for this offense. I mean, the rushing yards are through the roof. They're rushing for over 200 yards a game. Defensively, points allowed per game, turnovers, interceptions, all these categories, they are actually better than they were last year. So I think that, you know, people would just want to focus on a couple of interceptions, bad interceptions, bad decisions by a young quarterback, because of the expectations that were put on this young man as a true freshman last year after what we saw him do. There's no way he could have lived up to those expectations. He just couldn't. And I think he's going to get better. I think the are small mental mistakes that he's been making in his first. He's trying to do too much. He's trying to be the guy that everybody wants him to be instead of just being the Clemson quarterback. And it's coming back to bite him. But I guarantee you this, and this is not just me being a homer. This is objective. I watched all of these top 5 or 6 teams, pretty much all of their games, whether it was live or go back and watch it later. There's nobody that wants to see Clemson in December or January. If they think that they do, they're lying to themselves. Now, having said that, Ohio State looks amazing. Okay. I think that Ohio State and Clemson right now are probably the 2 most complete teams, right? Offensively and defensively in the country. Now that could change between now and when the postseason comes around, right? But LSU's got a great offense, defense, not really that great. Alabama's even got some defensive problems, and that's even without what's going on with Tua right now. Hopefully he gets better. Oklahoma, same difference. Great offense, much improved defense. However, it's still not great. It's just good. So what that leaves you with here is a group of really good teams that really any of those 6 or 7 top teams could all beat each other on any given day. It's just would be who plays better on that day.
So we're going to get to a situation in the college football playoff where I can guarantee there's going to be some level of controversy, because there always is. And for anybody who has told me that in the past there hasn't been in any particular year, I will certainly debate them, because I think there's always controversy, because it's not a perfect system. It's nothing close to a perfect system. That doesn't exist, won't exist, but there are certainly better ways of doing it. And I've come up with about 18 different ways of doing it better, but this is what we've got right now. So we got to compare teams that didn't play each other. we got to compare teams that in most cases didn't even play a team that played each other.
Uh-huh.
And so do you think there's any, it sounds like you don't, but there could possibly be a situation where Clemson's undefeated, Ohio State's undefeated, Oklahoma's undefeated. Somebody in the SEC, whether it be LSU or Alabama, certainly the Georgia situation helps out this scenario in terms of anybody else in the playoff race. But where there's a head-to-head there with Alabama, LSU, but it's a great game, one of them gets left out. But then we're looking at schedules saying, yeah, sure, they've got one loss, but they got one loss because they played them. They had to play them. Nobody else played anybody close to them, and it was a great game. So what do we do with that?
So I'm assuming what you're asking me is, do I think that there's 4 undefeated teams and one loss team, probably either in the Big Ten or the SEC, that somehow, based on the strength of schedule, that the one loss team would get in ahead of the undefeated team?
I'm not asking you should they or would they. I'm just asking you and basically making a statement that
you're asking me,
because we certainly, not necessarily the teams with the best record are the best teams.
Well, I agree with that. That's for sure. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into this. First of all, as far as could that happen, I don't think that could happen. I think if there's 4 undefeated Power 5 conference champions, they're getting in. If there's one loss team, even if it's LSU lost a 1-point game to Alabama, or Alabama lost a 1-point game to LSU, or whatever it is, the situation, I think you're going to see the 4 undefeated teams get in there. And we learned that last year with Notre Dame, right? Because, Notre Dame last year, they were a victim of how bad their opponents just happened to be that year. Notre Dame does not schedule a bad schedule. They go out and they schedule big boys, power programs, big names every year, but it was not their fault that last year Southern Cal was no good. It's not their fault that last year Stanford was no good. And I think they played Florida State as well. Florida State had an abysmal year, the worst year that they've had in probably 50 years, or at least in my lifetime. So that wasn't their fault, but they still got in even without a championship game. So I think what we've learned from the committee, and listen, they are inconsistent. And this is the one thing that I said on my video yesterday, because I know you and Uncle Lou and a lot of other YouTubers, and not just YouTubers, but also people on TV, some of the big name analysts on TV, they all come out with their own polls each week, and they all do it a little bit differently, and they all have their own reasonings for the way they do things. Well, that's all well and good. I don't do that, okay? Just because no offense to you or anybody else, but I don't think that your reasoning is any better than mine. It's just our opinions, right? But so what I tried to do in my video yesterday was project what the committee's going to do, not what I would do, okay? And even though I said 5 times in that video that these are not my opinions, I'm projecting or guessing what I think that they are going to do, I still got the comments, how could you have Clemson ahead of Oklahoma? Who have they played? This and that. But so I think it's fun to try to figure out what they try to do. It's not fun if you're the team that gets left out, that trying to figure out what they're trying to do, right? Because you're the team that got left out. But I think what we've learned so far is this is what I think they value the most, okay? I think they value, first of all, record. If you're a Power 5 team and you're undefeated, I think they're going to put you in unless there's some extremely crazy extenuating circumstances involved, okay? I think that next they value how good of wins you have, and if you have a loss, how good your loss is, a quote unquote good loss. And we hear that term all the time. And then third on the list, I think, is conference champion, because they say they value that, but we've seen non-conference champions get in the playoffs twice now. So they might value it, but they don't value it as much as they say that they do. And then fourth on the list, I think, is eye test. And this is where people that know football in that room, whether they're former coaches or players or whatever, this is where they come into play and can say, look, I know that this team has one loss and this team's undefeated, but I can tell you right now, this team that's got one loss is a much better football team on both sides of the ball than the one that's undefeated. And maybe that could be a tiebreaker. I don't know. But there's going to be some of these teams in the top, even after this week. I mean, we got 2 top 10 teams playing this week, LSU and Auburn. So that's going to move one of them out of the top 10 by most likely Auburn, I think, will move out of the top 10 with 2 losses by the time the first playoff poll comes out. And then in a couple of weeks, you've got LSU playing Alabama, and those are 2 top 5 teams. So they'll move around a little bit. So there'll be a lot of movement, and some of this will take care of itself.
There's a lot of bias involved. There's no question about that. If Minnesota had Clemson's resume or vice versa, if we flipped them and took the names off, there would be a certain amount of respect that would be given on the Clemson side versus, and I'm not just pointing out Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, etc., that would be given to those schools over a Minnesota, who is currently undefeated and wherever they're ranked right now. I don't look at the AP poll, could care less about it. I'm guessing they're about 15. I think I've got Minnesota at 12, which brings us to this video. So you have projected what the College Football Playoff Committee is going to select in its initial poll. So I'm asked to do this kind of stuff all the time. Predict who's going to win the Heisman, predict who is going to make the college football playoff or the first poll of the college football playoff, which I've done a couple times, but I've pointed out many times the ludicrous nature of this in predicting what somebody else is going to select. It's one thing to predict a game, but to predict what somebody else is going to select. So your rundown on this initial poll.
Yeah, so you're right. It's a guess. It's a complete guess, and it's just my guess. And people are going to disagree, and they may think that the committee is going to do it a different way. It's just really fun for me to do it because this is the number. Again, this is the number one thing you hear is people say, well, this week in the polls, the playoff committee will say they value this, and then the next week they'll be inconsistent and say they value this more, and so they're not consistent. So to me, it's fun to try to get into the minds of the committee and try to understand, even though nobody probably will completely understand exactly what their method of madness is. Like you said, there is certainly bias in there. But I won't give you the top 10. I'll give you the top 5 that I had for the first poll. Okay. And this is what caused a lot of disturbance as far as the viewers that I had commenting was. I had Oklahoma at number 5. That's where I think the playoff committee poll is going to put them, not where I would put them. Okay. So I think they would have Oklahoma at 5. And I think they would have Clemson at 4. Of course, I had Clemson fans coming on the channel saying, how dare you put Clemson at 4? I wasn't putting them there. I think that's where the playoff poll is going to put them. Okay. And again, some of these teams ahead of Clemson, Alabama, LSU play each other. That'll take care of itself. I had Alabama at 3. Some people didn't like that, right? Because they're number 1 in the AP poll. Well, the reason I had Alabama at 3 and Clemson at 4 is because I feel like their resume to this point is eerily similar. They've played basically the same level of talent, and they even have one common opponent. The only ranked team that either one of them played all year, and that was Texas A&M. A similar result, a domination from Alabama over A&M, a domination from Clemson over A&M. The only difference is Alabama does not have a 1-point close win over a unranked team like Clemson did with North Carolina. So that's the difference between those two schools. I think personally, in my poll, if I were to make one, that Ohio State should be number 1 until further notice. I think they look like the best team. I think they look like the most complete team. I think they have the best defensive end in the country, Heisman candidate at quarterback, a NFL running back who's destroying everybody, a J.K. Dobbins. But I think that the committee is going to put Ohio State at 2 instead of 1. The reason is because LSU, who I think they'll put at 1, provided that they win this week, which I think they will, is because LSU just has a better resume. They have better wins than Ohio State. And if you look at if you take the eye test, Ohio State looks better, more complete. If you take the resume battle, LSU's got the better resume. So that's the way I feel like they're going to do it this first week.
I'm a resume guy, and I'm looking at my top 5 right now, and it's LSU's number 1 because of what you just stated. Ohio State's number 2. They've been dominant against a pretty weak schedule to date, but they've played 4 marginal teams if you throw in Cincinnati in addition to their 3 Big Ten wins. I've got Penn State number 3. Beat Michigan, beat Iowa, beat Pitt. So you got 2 legitimate ranked teams, I believe, in Iowa. Difficult place to play at night. Penn State or Michigan at home. Pitt's 5-2. They're a decent team. They're a top 35-40 team. And every time I throw that out, some people jump on calling top 35 to 40 teams good teams, but nobody's beaten the top 10 teams. You know how many losses there are in the top 10? Like 1 or 2. So you can't find those wins. They don't exist.
All right.
And then I've got Clemson, Bama at 4, Clemson at 5. I base my distinction on what you stated there. Duke may win the Coastal Division in the ACC, which isn't a great feat, but still may distinguish themselves there. And Alabama throttled them in addition to the North Carolina game that you cite. And I think their performances against Texas A&M were pretty similar. And the South Carolina win looks much better right now. for Alabama.
Yeah, and
They destroyed them pretty easily.
So see, I understand the way that you do the way that you poll is very practical. I completely respect it. But the other part to that is like you say you had Penn State, I think at 3.
Yeah.
Okay, Penn State looks great. Okay. I'm not going to say they haven't. They're undefeated. But you'll have the people that hold Clemson's ACC opponents like a pit against them if they beat them by 4 touchdowns. And say, well, they're no good anyway. It's an ACC team. They should be beating them by 4 touchdowns. But whenever Penn State has a close win against them, that's considered a good win to some people. So, it's the perception. This is what hurts Clemson, especially last year and this year, because prior to last year, if you go back to 2017, 16, and 15, the ACC, that was an all-time high for the ACC as far as wins and talent and non-conference wins and all that sort of thing. So the past 2 years, it's really hurt Clemson, the perception of the ACC. Again, like you said before, is that Clemson's fault? No, of course it's not their fault. It's not their fault that Petrino ran Louisville's program into the ground last year. It's not their fault that Jimbo Fisher left and FSU basically backed out of a full commitment to the football program monetarily to try to keep up with the Joneses, the Clemsons, and everybody else, the major programs in America, and they ended up getting Willie Taggart. Not Clemson's fault. Not Clemson's fault that A&M the past 2 years, particularly this year, even though I think that A&M is a good win, by the way. I want to get that out there.
Well, I think it's a good win too.
Yeah, people that saying it's not because they have 3 losses. All 3 of those losses are to top 10 teams, 2 of them to top 5 teams. So, yeah, I mean, most people in America would lose to Clemson or Alabama. And
I will march out A&M against everybody but about 15 to 20 teams in the nation and expect them to have a pretty good shot at winning.
Right. So all these things Clemson can't control. Of course, we play South Carolina every year. Now, the good news for Clemson, I think, is most Clemson fans don't want to hear this. I think that if Clemson goes into Columbia and beats them by 2 or 3 touchdowns this year, that'll be considered a good win because South Carolina is another team that's a victim of their schedule and their record. I think that they're a better football team than their record says that they are. So if they continue to do okay and at least fight against some of these teams, and listen, if they go out and beat Texas A&M, if they beat Tennessee this weekend, I'm trying to think who else they have left on their schedule after that in the SEC. I think that might be it.
Looking at Alabama?
No, they already played Alabama. Anyway, but they've got Clemson.
Oh, you're talking South Carolina.
I'm talking about South Carolina. So
the rest of the East.
If they continue to look at least good and fight and win some of these games, listen, they've never beat Texas A&M since A&M joined the SEC, and they play them every year as a cross-divisional rival. So I think it's been 5 years now, and they've lost all of this 4 or 5 years. But that would be considered a good win for South Carolina if they can get themselves as a 3-loss team by week 12 or game 12 in the top 25. That would be a good win for Clemson, I think, and help them.
We're up against it to a certain extent, but I hear what you're saying. But if we take that schedule out of the equation and say we're going to respect this team because of what they've accomplished, because we know that they're really good, they've got NFL players all over the place. And maybe we're making that evaluation and not holding a schedule against somebody. And I'm not blaming Clemson for the schedule, but the schedule needs to be evaluated in my viewpoint because we don't have an objective system. So we've got to rate schedules and we've got to rate schedules. Otherwise, why don't we apply that to UCF? Put them in the playoff for 2 consecutive years because of their schedule. We should knock their schedule and say they won the games, and they won them in dominant fashion all the time.
That's a total another argument because, in my opinion, the group of 5 shouldn't be considered for the playoff. They should have their own playoff system. But that's a whole nother argument. It's a road we don't want to go down. Probably we'll have enough time for that. but I see what you're saying. But you know what the problem is, though? If you take 80% of the college football fans that are all clouded by their fandom and can't look at anything objectively and just want to see Clemson and Alabama go away because they're tired of them. If you ask these guys, they probably would tell you before the season even starts, whenever the schedule comes out for the next year, and it's set in stone for every team, they'd say, okay, before they even played a football game, this team has the hardest schedule in the country. This team has the second hardest. This has the third hardest. This team has the 4th hardest. Those should be the 4 teams in the playoff before you even play a football game because all that matters is strength of schedule and not how you look on the field. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think it's ridiculous. Of course, you got to then perform against that schedule.
Exactly. Well, that's my point. I mean, I understand
there are teams performing against difficult schedules and other teams performing against marginal schedules. So that's where the distinction is.
Yeah, but if you go back to like Ohio State, okay, I don't think that anybody would argue that probably Ohio State, at least the past 2 years since the ACC has been down, have had a tougher road to get to the playoff than a Clemson has, right? But Ohio State went on and lost by whatever it was, 3 touchdowns to both Iowa and Purdue. That's a totally different scenario than if Ohio State goes on the road to anybody in the Big Ten, even if it's a lower level Big Ten team, and loses by a field goal or a point. So how you win, if you're playing bad teams, you need to, for the most part, beat them badly. And how you lose, if you lose to a bad team, it shouldn't be by 3 touchdowns. All that plays a factor, along with the strength of schedule that you're playing.
Yeah, if we did it my way, we wouldn't have to evaluate wins and losses and say, well, the 31-point loss is worse than the 14-point loss versus this and that. We wouldn't have to do that because it would be an objective system that would take care of all that. Pigskin Pete, check out his videos, Clemson, college football, the ACC. Boston College is coming to town. 429 yards rushing by David Bailey and A.J. Dillon and company against NC State last week. Clemson giving up a 100-yard rusher for the first time in 27 games, I see. Javian Hawkins of Louisville in a lot of garbage yardage there at 45-10, but hopefully we can have you back soon. Pigskin, running out of time, unfortunately, but again, check out everybody Pigskin's Pizza content there on his YouTube channel. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Mark. It's always a pleasure, brother.